Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first class in a two-part series on imperialism yesterday and today. This is quite a time to be doing a course on imperialism because so much is changing in the landscape of US imperialism and of the world economy, especially over these last several months, but especially, even more so over the past few years. For a lot of the 2000s and 2010s, if we were taking a course like this, you could pretty much repeat the curriculum, year after year and just update a few things because imperialism was a pretty, I don't want to call it a stable system, but the main dynamics were the same for a long time. But a lot has changed, as we know, since the Trump administration has returned to power. So I want to start I'll introduce myself to everyone who might not be familiar with me. My name is CJ Atkins. I serve as the managing editor of People's World and also serve on the National Committee of the Communist Party. As far as my background for teaching a course like this, I did extensive graduate school training focused specifically on political economy for many years before I came to work for People's World. So this is kind of an area that I've spent a lot of time studying. By no means an expert, but I'll try to share what I've learned or what's useful. But I hope that the content is really just a kickoff to a discussion, and I hope everyone will come with not just questions, but also their own comments, their own viewpoints of some of the things that we'll be discussing. So as I said, this is the first class in a two-part series, and this session tonight, we begin with a review of the basic points of Lenin's classic book, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. We're going to have a look at its main arguments. We'll talk about why it was written, and then we'll think about how it helps us to understand the world today. If you saw probably in the emails promoting the class, if you, for some reason, you haven't been able to get a copy of the book, you can still pick up a copy on International Publishers website. They have a promotional code for the people attending this class. You can get, I think it's 40% off. So, and the code to get that discount is just the word imperialism with capital I at the beginning. So get a copy. If you haven't, you can still get a lot from the course, even if you haven't read it yet. But I hope that it will encourage you to pick up that copy and read it. Now, in the second session, when we come back on Wednesday, we'll be examining the current path of US imperialism today with special attention on how the Trump trade wars are reshaping world capitalism in ways, and the ways in which the ruling class is pursuing its new Cold War with China. So we'll be looking at how US imperialism in our own time, especially under Trump's nationalistic turn, how it fits into Lenin's framework, which is what we're going to be looking at this evening. So for now, let's get right into today's material. In the late 19th century, so we're talking the 1800s, right? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had done pretty extensive analysis on how the system of capitalism was developing, how it had succeeded previous economic systems like slavery or feudalism. And they looked at how it was trending more and more toward this centralization and concentration of ownership in the economy of capital. And they called that the process of monopolization. And they had written about this in a lot of works that you might be familiar with, of course, the Communist Manifesto, Capital, German Ideology, and several others. But just as Marx and Engels observed, capitalism is a dynamic system. It's always moving, it's always changing. And Lenin, he wrote his book, Imperialism, in 1916. It was in the midst of the First World War. And his was really one of several Marxist texts that were written dealing with the development of imperialism, how capitalism was transforming into this imperialist system. He was one of several around that time. Others included Nikolai Bukharin, who wrote Imperialism and World Economy, Rosa Luxemburg with The Accumulation of Capital, and Rudolf Hilferding wrote Finance Capital. That was a few years before, but the world was changing so much in this time. A lot of Marxists were trying to grapple with what was happening to world capitalism. All of them made important contributions to the study of global capitalism's development and how it had changed since the time of Marx and Engels. But it was really Lenin's little pamphlet-sized book of 120 pages or so. This is really the one that had the most impact on the working class movement at the time, and it's also the one that has most endured through the decades since then. So that was the context for sort of the ideological context in which Lenin was writing, but the actual practical context was war. Workers in so many countries at this time, they were being sent to the slaughter, to the killing fields, really, in the trenches of Europe, as some of these old empires battled each other for domination of the continent and for domination of the colonial world. These were empires like Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. And of course, there were newer powers rising on the scene too who were getting involved, like the US. The socialist parties around the world, and especially in Europe, but also in North America, they were splitting during this time. The leaders of many of those parties, of many of these working class political parties, they were actually coming out to support their own government's war efforts. The social democratic parties everywhere were breaking apart over this question of whether to join in the effort to defend their nations. There were things like votes on war funding, on the military draft. All of these kind of issues were putting those divides in the spotlight. But what Lenin wanted to show when he wrote his book was that the First World War was not about national defense. It wasn't about defending democracy. What he said was that it was a war among the imperialist powers to divide the world, and that workers, they did not owe their loyalty to any of those big powers. And really, this was kind of the catalyst for the foundation of separate communist parties in many countries, including in the US. And this book, Imperialism, was really aimed at trying to provide strategic direction for those socialists, now called communists, who were refusing to go along with their imperial governments. So what Lenin wanted to impress upon his readers was that imperialism is not just a policy choice. It's not just a direction chosen by politicians, by monarchs. Instead, it was a structural stage of capitalism. It was something that grew out of the monopolization process that Marx and Engels had talked about. It grew out of the growth of finance capital and of the need to export capital around the world as a means of overcoming crisis in the capitalist system in the advanced countries. All right. Lenin summarized imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century as having 5 main features. We're going to list them quickly here to start, but then we'll work through them one by one in more detail in just a moment. First of all, the concentration of production and capital. In short, this is simply the process of how monopoly corporations come to dominate capitalist economies. Okay, don't get too lost in like economic terminology here, because we're gonna explain these so that they sort of not just make sense as individual pieces, but we'll see how they all link together, how one flows to the next. Second, the fusion of banking and industrial capital. This is the period when you have a merger of what had been really 2 distinct and separate sectors of the capitalist class. And this is what Lenin called the rise of finance capital, when banking and industrial capital merge. Third, export of capital, which is money, essentially. Export of capital starts to become more important than the export of goods. Whereas before it was raw materials or finished products crossing borders, this is the time when the movement of money and investment starts to take over and become more prominent. Fourth, the formation of international monopolist associations, and they start dividing markets among themselves. So it's an era when capitalist cartels, these sort of conglomerations of different corporations, they start to cooperate but also compete for control. And as these forces become stronger, as they start to exercise their power over governments, that's when we start to see the fifth one, the territorial division of the world among the big capitalist powers. So as I said, each one of these features grows out of capitalism's own laws of motion, out of capitalism's own dynamics, which at its core is about the drive for accumulation and profit. And together, these features, according to Lenin's argument, they make imperialism the highest stage of capitalism, sort of its ultimate development of what capitalism is going to become. Okay, now, as I said, let's look at each of those features individually in some more detail. Again, capitalism, as Marx and Engels and other political economists had already shown, it begins with free competition, which is, you have one capitalist competing against another to see who can be more efficient in the production process, to see who can bring the best product to market, who can offer the cheapest price. The theory of the free market, essentially, and the invisible hand, which tells us that competition is good for efficiency, breeds innovation, and gives us all the cheapest prices. Okay, all well and good, right? That even Marx and Engels would say those are the positive things that we can see of capitalism. But where does it lead? What's the end result of that competition among different capitalists? Well, just like in any competition, in any race, eventually there's a winner, right? Or a small handful of winners. So competition among all of these different capitalists, eventually it starts leading to concentration. It's the idea of the one big fish that swallows the small ones. And by the early 20th century, when Lenin was writing his book, whole industries were becoming dominated by huge cartels and trusts. Ownership was being concentrated in smaller and smaller number of hands. Think about the big corporations of that period, like U.S. Steel in our country, or Standard Oil, which is what this illustration tries to show. The Standard Oil Corporation with its tentacles over every aspect of life, political, military, etc. Railroads were another one. But one example that I like to use to kind of really illustrate this process of monopolization in a very easy to understand way is the U.S. automobile industry. Since the very first car was sold on the market in the U.S., there have been more than 1,900 different manufacturers selling automobiles. That's not different models of car, distinctly separate companies, 1,900 companies. Now, by the 1950s, just a few decades into the existence of the auto industry, there were only three really left standing to dominate the whole industry: General Motors, Ford, Chrysler. And they controlled this sort of oligopolistic system that stood for decades before new competitors eventually emerged. Now today we see that same process happening in some of the tech sectors and investment sectors, right? Companies like Google, Amazon, BlackRock, they dominate their sectors, vast concentrations of power that can really have such a sway over world markets. So Lenin saw this process of monopoly as capitalism's way of surviving its own crises. It was the way that there was some injection of regularity, of stability into what was really kind of this anarchic system, the anarchy of competition. But he also said that this was an early indicator that capitalism is moving in a certain direction, away from that sort of uncontrolled stage of free market competition to a more planned, a more socialized system of production, which he said is laying the groundwork for the eventual move from capitalism to socialism. But to get there, it could be a difficult road in between, right? And that's what the imperialist stage is about. So, you know, as we said though, but just like monopoly was a way to sort of inject stability into a system, eventually it creates its own crises. And when those crises eventually come again, they become deeper and they're more likely to go global. If you remember the phrase "too big to fail" from several years ago, whenever the whole banking industry was in crisis, that's what we're talking about here. How monopoly it can seem to stabilize the system, be so solid, but then when something goes wrong, the whole thing is in danger, right? All right. So now the second feature, the merging of banking and industrial capital into finance capital. So this process, whereby you have these two distinct sectors of the capitalist class coming together, this created the material basis. It created the basis for a new kind of relationship between industry and banking. Lenin was following the analysis of a German economist, Rudolf Hilferding. We mentioned him earlier. He wrote the book Finance Capital. And what Lenin said was happening was that there was a merger of the capital of industry, of the companies that actually make things, and of the bankers, the ones with the money to finance it. And this merger happened in several ways, several steps. First of all, you had banks starting to expand their role beyond just lending money out. Instead, they started to own shares themselves in some of those industrial enterprises. Banks started to take seats on their boards. They started influencing management and investment decisions of the industrial companies. The industrial firms, in turn, with all of the profits they had accumulated, they start investing in or creating their own banks. That gives them the ability to control credit, to limit speculation that affects their business negatively. So over time, these two sectors, they start to become so interlinked, right? Through personal ties, through ownership structure, joint control. And Lenin called this the formation of the financial oligarchy. So in our country, in the United States, this process really got off the ground during the Civil War in the 1860s and the period right after that. And this is when banks and a lot of the big manufacturers in the North began to form tighter and tighter relationships because war is also a time of huge profit opportunities, right? In the Civil War, the fight to destroy slavery, it's no different than a lot of wars in that sense, in that weapons needed to be made and sold. Transportation had to be provided, the supply of food, uniforms, wagons, all of these things that the Union Army needed in the fight against the Confederacy. A lot of money could be made at that time. And banks and industry started cooperating very closely during that period. And then after the Civil War, that process accelerated rapidly during the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th. This was a time when the economy was alternating between boom and bust. So I just to kind of again put some meat on the bones of this, to give you an example. You've all probably heard of J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. A lot of us maybe we have accounts at a local branch of a Chase Bank or a Chase credit card. Well, this bank got its start back in 1871, right in this period we're talking about after the Civil War. And the most famous head of that bank was John P. Morgan, and he gives the bank its name. As the head of a bank, he took the steps to execute a series of mergers, of buying out other banks and also industrial companies in this time, acquiring more and more, so that by the early 1900s, in just like 20 to 30 years, his bank, Morgan Bank, effectively controlled the entire steel industry in this country in the form of U.S. Steel. It controlled the manufacture of appliances, household goods, and industrial machinery in the form of General Electric. Logistics, the transport of goods once they're produced, because it owned dozens and dozens of railroads. So this is the process Lenin's talking about. You have this merger of banking and industry in a single sector. Another billionaire, John D. Rockefeller, he used all of the profits from his monopoly over the oil industry. He used the money he made from oil to start his own bank. He called it Chase. So both these two cases, you know, J.P. Morgan Bank taking over industry and Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company creating its own bank, Chase, these are examples of what Lenin was talking about, this merging of banking and industrial capital to form this new oligarchy of finance capital. And, you know, to sort of complete the story, those two banks, Morgan and Chase, well, they later merged. They became one company, and that's how we have today's J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. And it's the world's largest financial institution, $3.79 trillion in capital as of today. So we get finance capital, right? And this new merger of the capitalist class, it starts to direct entire economies, controls credit, controls mergers, controls investment. And when you can control access to the money that businesses, that governments need, when you can control access to that money, well, then you, as the capitalist class, you start to really influence the direction of economic development and political policy. So, you know, when Lenin was writing, he meant, you know, these were individual banking families. They were industrial trusts. Today, we talk in terms of Wall Street, of global hedge funds and the big investment banks. But the key thing to take away is that this merger into finance capital meant that every corner of the world was now being seen as a potential place for investment. And that means also a place for domination. All right, so we've gotten through the process of the formation of monopoly, then the formation of finance capital. So once we now get to this period where monopolies are dominating in the home market, in the advanced capitalist countries, right? Finance capital now controls the market, it's saturated, they control every aspect of the domestic economy. What happens? Well, these capitalists, they need new channels for making profits, right? So what do? Well, they start to turn their eyes outward. So once you have monopolistic trusts and financial oligarchy gaining control over domestic markets, they're now looking for international opportunities to make profits. Now, initially, this sort of outward turn, it took the form of what was called taking the unseized parts of the world. These were places which were not yet capitalist, but also not connected to or ruled yet by any of the existing capitalist powers. At that time, this meant primarily Africa and East Asia. You know, these were not economically developed places. So the profits that were going to be gained there, those profits were not going to be made by selling people in Africa or people in Asia the goods made in the factories of America or England, right? These are not places with a lot of money, wealth to buy those products. So instead, that's why you see a difference. Instead of selling commodities, selling goods to those places, Lenin said we start to see the export of capital instead of the export of commodities. So instead of, you know, selling them steel or trains or appliances, instead capitalists ship their money there. They ship their capital, and that comes in the form of investments in resource extraction, in mining, agriculture, energy, you name it, right? Primarily, this is an effort to exploit the colonies for their resources and for the cheap labor. And that's really how imperialism starts to deepen, and it still does it to this day, to deepen global inequality, because the profits flow from those underdeveloped countries, from the periphery to the core, to the heartland of the empire, so to speak, you know, back to New York, back to London, back to Paris. But we have to ask, you know, before we go too far down this road of sort of pitting the capitalist core against the periphery, who is it inside those core countries, the core imperialist countries, who is it that those profits, those riches are flowing to? And I bring this up because, when we're talking about this relationship between imperial and colonized nations, we should not become confused into thinking that the working class in the advanced capitalist countries are beneficiaries of this system by and large. Because, if we think about, if we're exporting capital, we're sending money, let's say from the US to some republic in Central America. That shipment of capital, that shipment of profits, that came from the exploitation at home, right? This redirection of profits outward, that was resources that could have gone to the working class at home. It's resources that came out of the exploitation at the factories and at the job sites within the advanced imperial core country. That's money that could have gone to raise pay, to improve living standards, to provide education or healthcare, right? But instead, those profits were sent outward, not to help or aid some other country, but rather to further exploitation in other lands. So I just want to look at this quote we have from Lenin here, which is kind of a key phrase describing this process. Lenin said that capitalism could raise the standard of living of the masses, who are everywhere still poverty-stricken and underfed in spite of the amazing advance in technical knowledge. But if capitalism did these things, it wouldn't be capitalism. Surplus capital will never be utilized for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in a given country, because this would mean a decline in profits. Instead, it will be used for the purpose of increasing those profits by exporting capital outward, abroad to the backward countries. In today's world, we still see this same process, right? This same logic in forms like offshoring of production, debt dependency, the built-in inequalities of a lot of global value chains. We'll look more deeply at some of those next time, but I just want you to kind of grasp the movement that we're seeing here, that instead of selling goods, we're talking about the movement of money as the key defining trait of the imperial system. Okay, now as this export of capital, as this proceeds, as it gets underway, and as the financial oligarchies of the advanced capitalist countries begin to extend themselves out into the underdeveloped countries of the world, well, this sets off a competition, right? And Lenin showed that these monopolies, these financial oligarchies, yes, they compete, but they also cooperate to control the world. And that the level of competition or cooperation is kind of determined by how powerful they are in relation to one another. Which one has greater wealth, greater resources behind it. It's basically a division of the colonial spoils, depending on who's got the biggest seat at the table. And I say it in that way, like the biggest seat at the table, because literally it came down to wealthy industrialists and financiers and government officials sitting down at tables to decide the fate of peoples in the colonial world. In the late 19th century, early 20th, you start to see these international cartels negotiating with each other to divide markets, to set prices, to manage resources. Now, you remember how I mentioned a moment ago how they divided up the unseized parts of the world? Here, think along the lines of, think about, the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, when they did sit down and decide who gets what part of Africa. No one from Africa was present to have any say in that. It was purely the financial oligarchy of the world sitting down and deciding who gets which piece. So capitalists and the governments that they controlled, whether it's the French, the British, Belgian, the German, they start carving up the African continent among themselves. In Latin America, US monopolies start turning their interest toward expansion and acquisition of territories in the same time period. Late 1800s into the 20th century, you get Spanish-American War, the series of so-called banana wars that played out in Central America well into the 1920s and 30s. So yeah, in his day, Lenin was talking about, these capitalist alliances were things like oil and rail and mining. Today, we would point to things like big pharma, big tech, and some of the trade agreements that lock in corporate power. So these cartels, they turn the old system of free trade into this really highly managed system of capitalist coordination. And as I said, it takes place under the dominance of the strongest powers. Again, let's look at a quote from Lenin here, because I don't want you to think that this is solely motivated by, oh, we want territory, or we are, pursuing some religious crusade, or we are going to exercise our racial domination. All of these things are factors, right? Especially in the older system of colonialism. But as Lenin points out here, these capitalists almost had no choice in terms of what the economic laws of the system were forcing them to do. So he wrote in the book, he says, the capitalists divided the world, not out of any particular malice, but because the degree of concentration which has been reached forces them to adopt this method in order to get profits. Remember, we said that monopoly system forces them to find new markets, right? And they divide the world in proportion to capital, in proportion to their strength, because there can be no other system of division under commodity production and capitalism. Parallel with this fact, and in connection with it, certain relations are established between political alliances, between states, on the basis of the territorial division of the world. So these cartels, these trusts of the monopolies, they have their parallels, right, in the alliances among capitalist states. The German and Austro-Hungarian alliance, the British, French, Russian alliance, etc. So these states, acting almost not directly as the instruments of the financial oligarchy, but in a lot of ways behaving as such. They divide the world, they compete, they cooperate if circumstances require it. But then what about when it's time to redivide, right? When the level of strength, say, of one alliance or one set of monopolies gets stronger than it had been, and they want to redivide the spoils. And what happens when there are no more new colonies to simply split up? That brings us to Lenin's fifth feature of the imperial stage of capitalism, which is the world's redivision among the great powers. By the time he's writing in the midst of World War I, pretty much every territory that was not an independent state, pretty much every territory had been claimed by one colonial power or another. That's the case when you look across the African continent, most of Asia, and the Asia-Pacific region. So now imperialism is not just about finding new, supposedly unclaimed lands. That old system of colonialism might have been just grabbing unclaimed territory and exploiting its people and its resources, but that was passing away. Imperialism was now about redividing the globe. Territories could only pass from one owner to another, instead of passing from being supposedly unowned to one owner. And what Lenin said is that this inevitably leads to war. And for him, this was really the root of World War I. That earlier competition between capitalist enterprises, that had been replaced by a competition among capitalist states. And these states were the vehicles for the financial oligarchies within their borders, for finance capital within their borders. And the old system of market competition was now replaced by military competition. Now, this analysis that Lenin put forward, it showed how imperialism functioned and how the economic logic of monopoly capitalism compelled states. It pushed governments to compete for colonies. And this is what, as we said earlier, this is what really sets him apart from other writers and theorists of this period. There were a lot of ideas circulating about what is imperialism, how do we deal with its consequences, what will it lead to. One popular theory at the time, it was put forward by a British anti-imperialist named John Hobson, and he said that imperialism is a policy choice. It's a decision made by politicians And capitalists of the world, if they are smart, if they want to protect their common profits, they will push the politicians to stop this imperial drive to war and conquest because it's just going to be destructive. Okay, that was one theory. Another prominent idea was that as the world economy becomes more integrated, this global capitalist economy, well, it will eliminate the need for war. You know, countries and capitalist classes will find that it's better to cooperate to exploit the colonial world together. And this was an idea put forward by Karl Kautsky, who was a social democratic analyst at the time. And Lenin, if you read the book, you know, he sharply critiques this idea of sort of an ultra imperialism. I think it's in the seventh chapter or so. So Lenin says no. He says no to all of these kind of ideas. He pointed out that when you look at how monopoly replaced competitive capitalism, how financial and industrial capital had merged to form finance capital, how that financial monopoly then came to dominate national economies and was forced to expand outward in search of places to export capital and seek fresh profits, and then how financial monopolies divided the world among themselves, how they used governments as their instruments for that competition. Lenin said, if you look at this logic, then you inevitably end up at a situation where military competition and war to redivide the world is what's going to happen. And that is exactly the world that he and others were living in at that time. So he showed that there was a logic, there was a law in how capitalist imperialism had developed and how it functioned. You know, he wrote in the book that, you know, if you want to keep it simple, you can say that the briefest definition of imperialism is that it's the monopoly stage of capitalism. But then when we break that down and we look at these 5 features, we see that there's a lot packed into that brief definition that he tried to give. All right, let's kind of fast forward a bit. You know, today the world is different. These old formal colonies, they've mostly disappeared, right? But that same logic still applies when you look at the placement of military bases, of trade blocs, of sanction regimes, of financial control over whole national economies by banks and investment firms in the core countries. So a lot of that logic is still playing out, just in a different format. So the other thing to keep in mind is that, and that Lenin wanted his readers to know, is that this system of imperialism is not stable. It is perhaps a solution for a time to capitalism's crises, but it's also something that deepens contradictions. It deepens the contradiction between the capitalist class and the working class inside the imperial countries. It deepens the contradiction between the different imperialist powers, and it deepens the contradiction between the imperial countries and the colonized countries, the core and the periphery. So just like these other stages in the development of capitalism, what imperialism does is push crisis outward, right? Each stage in the development of imperialism is a reaction to capitalism's natural tendency to crisis. Just think about finance capital coming to dominate an economy, right? Once you have come to control an entire national economy, that's a point of crisis, right? That's when they start to begin looking outward. So imperialism is like this expanding outward pressure of capitalism's natural internal crisis and its tendency towards stagnation. But because the entire world, as we said, is already divided, new rivals can only rise by taking something from existing powers. Crisis can only be overcome by war in the long run. And that's what Lenin meant when he talked about the inevitability of inter-imperialist war. Okay, now let's quickly just consider what some of this means, you know, for practical political action. Well, what Lenin showed in this book is that capitalist imperialism is a single worldwide system of exploitation. You know, capitalism had developed into this world system of finance capital with a handful of capitalist states dominating the rest of the globe. But the key thing here is that the same monopolies and banks that are squeezing profits from the working class at home, they're also the ones investing abroad, draining those super profits from the colonies and the semi-colonies. And so what Lenin pointed out was that workers in the advanced capitalist countries and the people of the oppressed colonies have a common enemy. And that's the international bourgeoisie, the capitalist ruling class, which is organized through monopoly and through imperialism. So what this meant was that there is now a basis for joint political action and for international solidarity. And it goes beyond just, sort of the generic idea that, oh, war is bad for everyone. Yeah, war is bad. But many social democrats at the time, they did not see this point. And they were backing their ruling class in its fight with other countries' ruling class. And what Lenin said was, no, workers in the advanced capitalist countries, their interests do not lie with their ruling class. Their interests lie with the workers in the other imperialist countries and with the people in the oppressed countries, the colonial countries. And like we said, that fact was really the foundation for the split of the world socialist movement and the founding of the communist parties. But Lenin did warn that imperialism will use some of those super profits from colonial exploitation to effectively bribe a small upper layer of workers inside the imperialist countries. He used the term labor aristocracy, which is kind of a catch-all term for this layer, which is made up of reformist, social democratic, liberal politicians, some trade union leaders, etc. This group who are convinced that they benefit from imperialism, and they often side with the ruling class. And that helps to maintain divisions within the workers' movement. I've put a few photos here just to kind of give us an idea of the type of things Lenin was talking about. You have the Sean O'Brien speaking at the RNC last summer. But what I want you to take away is that this idea of labor aristocracy and this this effort to split off a piece of the workers' movement, it's a lot like how capitalism uses racism to divide white workers from Black, Latino, and immigrant workers, or how it uses misogyny to keep men and women workers divided. Lenin wanted people to take away the point that the vast majority of workers inside the imperialist countries, they have an interest in uniting with the oppressed peoples of the colonies against the same imperialist system. And even those labor aristocrats, those reformist political leaders, even if they think they are winning from imperialism, the truth is that they can't even see that the exploitation that the system perpetrates abroad is still translating to their own exploitation here at home as well. All right, so we're just kind of transitioning to the content which we'll focus on next week. Sorry, not next week, at the next class. We've kind of concluded our overview of the main points of Lenin's classic book. But that was written 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, right? But we're Marxists. We know that the world and the class struggle is always moving, always developing, and there's a lot that's different in the world now than it was in Lenin's time. A lot has happened since then. There was the rise and fall of a socialist world system, another world war and the defeat of fascism. There was the development of nuclear weapons, which are so powerful they can destroy the whole planet and make at least parts of the ruling class, a little more reluctant to rush to war sometimes. There was the national liberation and anti-colonial movements of the second half of the 20th century. We had the onset of globalization and neoliberalism, and of course the rise of the new fascism that we're currently living through. So even though the colonies in the old sense might have disappeared, the exploitation hasn't, and they're living on. So the point to take is that imperialism adapts over time, but its essence, monopoly domination, export of capital, repartitioning of the world, a lot of those things are still largely in play. And many of the forces that Lenin analyzed are still at work, even in a different context or form. Even the new economy empires that are the big thing in the media right now, the whole world of AI and high tech, these things still rely on a lot of the old imperialist infrastructure. You can't have a data center in North America that's run by Google or Amazon without the rare earth metals that are mined in Africa or in China. You can't take those metals and make the chips needed, the computer chips needed for those data centers. You can't make those without the factories, the labor in Asian factories. All of these capital flows, these are of course controlled by the monopoly interests in the imperial core. So just keep that in mind as we move to next week, when we're going to talk about what imperialism looks like at this moment under the Trump administration. So let's just close by looking at, again, re-emphasizing that final takeaway that Lenin gives us. And this is what's most important for our orientation of our political action, of our understanding of the world, of how we show our solidarity. And that's, by exposing imperialism as a global stage of capitalism, Lenin also reframed socialism as an international struggle. The fight for socialism in one country could not divide itself or ignore what was happening in other places in the world, especially for those of us who are fighting for socialism in the imperial core. The world Lenin wanted us to remember, the world is not just divided between nations, rather it's divided into classes, right? The international bourgeoisie in all the advanced capitalist countries, and even the less developed capitalist countries on one side, and the oppressed classes and nations on the other. That's the global proletariat. That's workers everywhere, here and elsewhere, and it's colonized peoples as well. So Lenin's analysis, as we said, really provides the foundation for that strategic alliance between workers everywhere, together with the liberation movements. It's a unity that was kind of at the very base of the Communist International and many of those anti-colonial revolutions that came in the 20th century. So final takeaway is that what Lenin proved was that anti-imperialism and class struggle, they're not separate things. They're the same fight on different fronts. And that's why communists to this day still say that you can't really oppose what capitalists do to workers here at home in the United States, and then support what US imperialism does abroad to workers and peoples in other countries. Okay, so as I said, in our next class, we're gonna take a lot of what we studied today. We're gonna connect Lenin's framework up to a concrete example, and that is the US ruling classes turn away from the globalization model of imperialism, which really was sort of that unipolar world of US dominance. It's defined the last few decades, but it's changing, right? And sectors of the US ruling class are recognizing that. So we're going to look at how US imperialism is reorganizing itself, and see how there are echoes of Lenin's logic of redivision and competition, and we'll do that in the context of this new Cold War against China. So that concludes the material that I prepared for the night. So I'll turn it to Dee, who's moderating. So this is the time for any kind of comments, ideas, questions, etc. So thanks for giving me the time so far.
Okay, thank you, CJ. We're looking for raised hands. If you have a comment or question, please click the picture of the raised hand on your control panel. Sandy, your mic is open on our end. Click the mic on your control. There you are.
Oh, good. Thank you very much, Dee. My question has to do with, well, Marx and Engels raised the question of workers of the world unite, or not a question, a demand. And there was a period, at least, when we were using the term workers and oppressed peoples of the world unite. Is that still a relevant demand, and how is that changing?
Okay, thank you, Sandy. We will take a few more comments and questions before we turn the mic back over to CJ. Okay, Roberta, we're opening your mic. There you are.
Oh, thanks for the great explanation, CJ. Could you apply some of what you were talking about to what's going on Middle East with Israel and Palestine, and how the imperialism is, specifically creating that situation, and maybe the oil interests? That's what I've heard.
Okay, thank you. Let's take one more comment or question before we turn the mic back to CJ, looking for raised hands. Okay, Para, is that Ishmael Para or Emil Para? There you are. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Go on.
Yes. You spoke and listed some of the transformations that capitalism has developed through to its current situation. And you spoke of the crises in each case, but you didn't speak about the crises. You only said that there were crises at the different nexus or junctures in the development. Can you speak a little bit to each of those crises?
How do you pronounce your first name?
Ismael.
Okay, it's not, there's no, well, on your control.
No, yeah.
Yeah, it's not spelled properly. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, CJ, you have the floor.
All right. Thanks for those questions so far. I think I'll just kind of start in order to discuss some of them. I'll give some thoughts I have, but I encourage others, if you were also provoked by one of the questions or comments of others, join the list to give your thoughts on it too. So Sandy was asking about the classic slogan of the communist movement, "Workers of the World Unite," which was the closing line of the Communist Manifesto, and Sandy mentioned how there was a period of time where the movement had expanded that slogan to "Workers and Oppressed Peoples of the World Unite," and asking whether that's still relevant. From my understanding, that expansion of the slogan that you're talking about, "Workers and Oppressed Peoples of the World Unite," I think it really kind of came out of this period, actually, of Lenin's analysis, and how the new Soviet state after the Russian Revolution became an ally and a support of those early iterations of national liberation movements, of showing solidarity and support with those peoples who were trying to overcome colonial oppression. So that's sort of where that slogan comes from. The Communist International was a big advocate of that slogan for so long, and many movements still use that expanded form. Is it still relevant? I would say that yes, but in a different way maybe than it was at that time. When that slogan came about, "Workers and Oppressed Peoples of the World Unite," there were still huge swaths of the global population, huge chunks of the global population, which had not yet been fully brought into the circuit of capital, right, into the capitalist system, so to speak. So many of these oppressed peoples were still living under feudalist systems, under old-style colonial domination, not yet really pulled into the proletariat, so to speak, right? So that's why that slogan kind of expanded. It wasn't just going to be the workers or peasants, farmers of the factory. It was going to also be all of these oppressed people, So, okay, let's fast forward. Now we're in the 2020s. The vast majority of the world's population has now been pulled into those circuits of capital, right? Very few economies are sort of distinct or isolated from international capital flows. So in that sense, a lot more people are workers now, right? So, okay, workers of the world covers a lot more ground than maybe it did initially. But there are still a lot of people who are shut out of those circuits, who are still living semi-feudal kind of existence in many areas of the world. And they're subject to this system of exploitation, but in a different way. So, you know, if I was giving my thought, I think that that expanded form of the slogan does still have relevance in some places more than others, maybe, depending on you know what the main area of political work is or the population that's being targeted. So I would say it's not necessarily ready to be thrown out, but there are a lot more people who would maybe be considered working class as we understand it than maybe there was at the time that slogan came about. So those are my thoughts on that. Roberta was asking if we could apply some of what we're talking about to the Middle East, to Israel, to Palestine, and how imperialism is specifically creating that situation, and then maybe reference to oil interests. Well, you're kind of getting a little bit into what the next class is about, which is, you know, some of the specific dynamics of imperialism today. But without going too far into that, or without trying to do a full class analysis of Israeli society, for instance, which I don't feel qualified to do necessarily, from the perspective of U.S. imperialism, which is the main imperialism that we have to talk about, you know, the factions of the capitalist class that are grouped around Trump, they definitely still see the energy resources of the Middle East, and by that we mean oil. That is definitely something that they want to control for the long term. You know, for all the talk about solar, wind energy, all of this, I mean, the Trump administration is throwing that out the window anyway. But regardless of whether you're talking about Trump and the Republicans or the Democrats under Biden and Harris, whoever is, you know, the political leadership of U.S. imperialism at any given time, that whole region remains very strategic. They want to control it. And I think having the Israeli state as sort of an intermediary, an actor in that regard, is very useful. Not only useful for trying to control whatever resources are under Israeli or Palestinian territory, but for maintaining instability in that region, because instability and having multiple powers all at each other's throats in that region, well, that benefits U.S. imperialism, right? Because then it can pick sides, it can arm one against the other, it can support the Gulf monarchies against Iran, it can use Israel to maintain division between Iran and the other Gulf countries. So that whole situation of the Israeli state keeping an unstable Palestine, that benefits U.S. imperialist interests for trying to control that region and for making sure that other powers don't increase their pull there. The Soviet Union, for instance, back in the 60s, 70s, had a lot of influence among governments in the Middle East, and I think that U.S. imperialism is determined to make sure that we don't go back to that kind of time where someone else could really challenge their control there. I hope that helps. Of course, you can also get into the question of the natural gas reserves that are in Palestinian waters. I mean, there are riches to be made there directly in that way too, right? So that's another aspect of it. But hopefully we can situate that more in the next class also when we talk about the bigger strategy of U.S. imperialism right now. Ismail talked about how, okay, a lot of the transitions were listed and how capitalism developed through those different transitions, those 5 features, and how crisis fueled or forced all of this. And then wanting to talk a little bit about each of these crises. Yeah, so when we talk about crisis fueling some of those stages in the development of capitalism, we are talking about specific events. You know, whenever we think about crisis, we all think, oh, Great Depression or the Great Recession. We are talking about events like that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s specifically, because as we said, you know, it was a time of boom and bust. But we're also sort of, you know, using our Marxist methodology, we're stepping back at an abstract level a little bit and looking at the logic of how capitalism functions. Okay, so you have the anarchy of free competition. Monopoly becomes the system that sort of replaces that, right? As a natural process of concentration happens. But at a certain point, monopoly, once it dominates a specific single national economy, once you have monopoly capital in control of everything, well, you start to run out of places to make money, right? You start to run out of places to invest profitably. And so in Marxist terms, that's sort of a crisis point. That means capitalism is up against a wall. The model of accumulation has to change, right, to enable profits to continue growing and exploitation to continue, et cetera. And so in those kind of terms, that's what we mean by crisis. And so when monopoly enters a crisis in a specific country, you first have these sort of rearrangements of the capitalist class to try to deal with this, right? Okay, industrial capital and banking capital will get together. They will be able to, it's another level of consolidation, basically, right, of the class. But again, that eventually runs up against a wall and you start getting this outward expansion. Okay, so that's what I meant by crisis rather than specific events that like happened this year or that year. But as I said, you know, if you really get into studying the economic history of that period, you can start to map these things up to, you know, specific crises that happened, whether it be around currency or such. So I hope that kind of explains how I was using it. But if others, you know, have specific knowledge maybe about the economic history of that period, they could maybe share it and link those things up. That's what I have for the moment.
Okay, so we'll run through one more time, looking for raised hands to introduce comments or questions. Kanya, your mic is open on our end. There you are.
Yes, excellent presentation. Now, during the anti-colonial struggles and the national liberation movements, including the Vietnam War, there was an understanding that there is by the national liberation movements and the leadership that they made a clear distinction between the American people and the American government. And they went away with the idea that if they can get the support of the American people, that will advance the cause of national liberation or anti-colonial struggles. And specifically the American working class, that they are the ones who can shut down the imperialist system there and ease the burden of national liberation. So in a way, there was an understanding that there is a special responsibility. I don't know if that's the correct phrasing, of the American people and the American working class, because they have in their power to shut down the system. How do you, can you, if that is an accurate representation, can you comment on that, or is it an error in putting that kind of responsibility on the American people and the American working class? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see if there are any more. Michael, your mic is open on our, there you are.
Oh,
There you are.
hi, Dee. I thought my wife was going to make my partner was going to make a comment here, but I had a couple of comments. The really interesting presentation. I was starting to think when I was listening to this kind of like this presentation about how capitalism is pushed by its crises to develop in forms that are more outward, more efficient. There's this drive. I'm also reminded of the way that slavery in the United States pushed, from the Deep South into the Southwest, along with the, bringing a war with it into the far West, and coming to a point where virtually the entire United States outside of the Northeast was potentially open for the institution of slavery. and how Du Bois talks about the fact that both the need for new land and also the crisis in the prices that were being paid internationally for Southern cotton were the forces that really drove the Civil War in the United States. And not to, the other thing I just wanted to toss out is that it's my understanding, and I might be wrong about this, it's been a couple of years since I've read that book, but that Lenin specifically addresses this issue about whether colonial people are ready for a revolution, and this idea that colonized people live in feudal or semi-feudal systems and therefore they're not workers. And that his response to that is that global capitalism has already penetrated every economic reality on the planet. And that as a result, these people are already living under capitalist conditions, and their movements are therefore anti-capitalist movements by nature. So that, and it was a dividing point, right? I mean, when I think of the Cuban Party pre-revolution and its sort of rejection of a revolutionary mentality because Cuba had not reached a fully developed capitalist stage, and therefore, according to Marx, it couldn't, skip the stage of capitalism and go directly to socialism. I think Lenin's response to that was, you are already living under capitalism as a colonized people and underdeveloped people. If you're going to wait until you achieve developed capitalism, you'll be waiting forever because you're never going to get it. Anyway, really, really interesting presentation. I apologize for taking all the time.
Thank you. Maybe we'll see if there's one more. Henry, your mic is open on our end. There you are.
Hi, thank you. That was a very concise and clear explanation. I really appreciated that. So the question is this: was World War II an extension of the conflict of World War I, a redivision of the world by imperial states? And if so, how does the socialist USSR fit into this pattern? And similarly, how do you explain the two opposing alliances? Thank you.
Thank you. And before we turn the mic back to CJ, let me remind you that on Wednesday night, this Wednesday night, October 22nd, the second class will be held at 8 p.m. Eastern, and we hope you will join us and get others to join us as well. So for the last time, CJ, the mic will be turned to you so you can respond to the comments and questions, and you can also offer your summary.
All right, some interesting angles that people have with the comments and questions. I'll go again in order. I'll respond to what I think was Conyer was the person's name, talked about during a lot of those anti-colonial and national liberation struggles like Vietnam War, there was this understanding that the American working class had a special responsibility to try to shut down imperialism from on the inside, in a way to speak, and how those movements in those countries, they did distinguish between what the U.S. government was doing and the U.S. people. I don't think it was an error to say that, because you asked, was it an error to put that level of responsibility on the American working class? I don't think it's an error to put that responsibility on the American working class, because I do have faith that, with the right organization, with the right development, the working class in the United States is up to that task of ending U.S. imperialism. And I think, Vietnam is a good example of where U.S. imperialism was hit from within and from without. You had the determination and struggle of the Vietnamese people to expel this foreign invader from their land, this foreign occupier. But you also had the explosion of an anti-war movement with its most advanced sectors being explicitly anti-imperialist in the U.S. at that time. It took some time, right, to build that up. It took a lot of on-the-ground organizing, coalition building, but we had a movement that was able to play that kind of role, to demand bring the troops home now, stop the bombing. So I think history provides us with examples like that, where the working class of the United States does show that it has that capacity, not only to show solidarity, but to also realize and to see that these wars are not to our benefit either, right? Every dollar spent on war is a dollar not spent on healthcare, on education, on childcare, on you name it, right? So I think that the American working class has taken up that responsibility, and it's the job of communists and others in the movement to try to advance that at every opportunity we have in the peace movement and beyond that. And Lenin also himself talked about that. If you've read his letter to American workers, that was an aspect of what he said when he addressed the working class in the US directly, just a couple of years after he wrote Imperialism. Comments to was it Michael, I think, starting about how capitalism is pushed by crises to drive outward, and you were reminded of Du Bois and how he talked about the slave system in the South was constantly pushing outward, and how prices of commodities like cotton determined a lot of the dynamics of the war. I think you're right, and Du Bois spent a lot of time looking at this instance of the U.S. Civil War, also looking at that scramble for Africa that we talked about. And people, when they want to read about imperialism, they think about, oh, well, let's go read Lenin and such. Yes, read Lenin, but Du Bois, I'm glad you brought him up, because he's quite an analyst of these phenomena too, and he's somebody that should be read. And the slave system in the South was also, beset by crisis and running up against all kinds of limitations in its own system. So I think it's an appropriate one to bring up as an example. Your second comment was about Lenin addressing the issue of whether colonial people are ready, and saying, well, you're already under capitalism, right? So you can't wait around for it to be fully developed. I mean, the Russian Revolution that Lenin led was also an acknowledgement of that, right? That sometimes circumstances will dictate that the chain will break, so to speak, at its weakest point. It won't always be in the most advanced, developed capitalist economy. But if that realization of Lenin has to be paired with the points that I think he made a few years later, during the new economic policy, when other revolutions did not happen and Russia had to make it on its own, and he had to go back to Marx and Engels, right, and say, okay, well, to build socialism, you do have to have a certain kind of economic foundation to do that. And the great service of the Soviet Union in later decades was that it tried to be that support to the countries that were throwing off colonialism, that were throwing off imperialism, right? Places like Cuba, like you mentioned. But it's a very complex situation, right? Whenever you're an underdeveloped country trying to develop an advanced system like socialism. So anyway, that kind of maybe speaks to your comments. Finally, with our last bit here, Henry talked about World War II, the 1939-45, and whether that was an extension of World War I, and was it a redivision of the world by imperialist states? And if so, how does the USSR fit? How do we explain those alliances? World War II, we have to, if we look at Japanese imperialism and how it was trying to take over much of East Asia in the 30s, before the World War was even declared. If you look at a lot of the motivations of fascist Italy and its campaigns in Africa, Ethiopia, if you look at the motivations that Germany had for its plans of expansion, in a lot of these, the ruling class of these societies, they were in a way, you know, still refighting that partition, refighting that division of the world, where if they saw that their system, their capitalist system, had been sort of either the loser or not gotten all the benefits from that earlier one. So in that way, yeah, there was a lot of carryover, right, of the unfinished business in the eyes of some of these ruling class, some of these fascist and militarist leaders. But the USSR was the different factor here, right? In the 30s, as a lot of these fascists were starting to become more aggressive, the default position of most of the capitalist states was to appease them, to try to give them what they want. Let's negotiate. We can still have, you know, a sort of cartel arrangement, redivide parts of the world or whatever. But unlike the First World War, you now had a very powerful socialist state, an anti-fascist state. And I think once Nazi Germany turned that war against the USSR, the character of the war also changed, right? It now took on a definite anti-fascist character, and even the other capitalist states who ended up aligned with the USSR, they also saw an interest in defeating this capitalist power that was Germany, that was Italy, that was Japan. So I think to understand that war, it has multiple characters, I guess. It can be characterized in a number of ways, and depending on where we're at in the timeline, which one took prominence, I guess. That would be how I would kind of look at it. Hope that's clear. That's it.
Okay, so we hope, again, the second session of the class will be Wednesday night, October 22nd. We hope you will join us at 8 p.m. Eastern and to continue the conversation. So thank you for participating tonight. Thank you, CJ, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.